Hello, I'm Jan Szerwiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. In this episode, we're diving deep into a geopolitical whirlpool where Moscow's influence might just be swirling down the drain. With the war in Ukraine extending well into its third year, and with reshuffles at the Kremlin, it might just be enough for Russia's neighbors to reconsider their alliances. Buckle up, because we're about to zip through some countries that used to form the Soviet Union that are getting quite a draft from the winds of change. But first, let's take a look at our most recent report to find out more.
The CSTO is a military alliance connecting a few post-Soviet states, including Russia and Armenia. The spokeswoman of the Armenian Foreign Ministry, Ani Badalian, announced that Yerevan would no longer contribute to the organization's budget and has stopped taking part in the joint military exercises. This comes as Armenia begins to sever ties with Russia, following the full takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan in September of 2023 and Moscow's passive approach to the conflict. Yerevan started to look for allies elsewhere. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan began to divest from the CSTO and instead intensified efforts to join the European Union.
It has become evident to all of us that the CSTO instruments and the instruments of the Armenian-Russian military political cooperation are insufficient for protecting the external security of Armenia. The decision is not directed against the CSTO and the Russian Federation. It comes from the interest of the country's external security, and taking such a decision is our sovereign right.
The CSTO was a rather dysfunctional, Russian-centered version of NATO, which was intended to keep post-Soviet states in a common security bloc. A few former Soviet republics refused to join outright, while Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan left the organization years ago. Now it has just 6 member states: Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. Kazakhstan's ties with Russia are cooling as well, while Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan engage in sporadic border skirmishes with each other. Armenia will likely fully exit the organization soon, leaving only Russia and Belarus as a remnant of the Soviet Union's military might.
And now we're zooming in to take a glance at the issue in greater detail. Let's start in Armenia, where recent protests have erupted over the return of 4 villages to Azerbaijan. The streets of Yerevan and other border regions are boiling not just with coffee, but with fiery public dissent. But here's the twist. Moscow, viewing these protests through rose-tinted binoculars, hoped they would slow Armenia's westward waltz. Spoiler alert, it's doing the opposite. Yerevan, spurred by the dissent, is now toying with the idea of a Russian military goodbye party, featuring the potential closure of Russia's Gyumri base. I mean, who needs Russian guards when you've got a growing Western fan club, right? And that's not all. Yerevan's bold steps seem to have inspired a bit of a trend among countries previously tied close to Moscow. Over in Tajikistan, the government there is also giving Moscow's military the stink eye, pondering over whether to keep the Russian military base or send it packing. It seems like Moscow's nightmare before Christmas came early this year, a potential domino effect of military evictions across its former backyard. Now, what's Moscow's playbook here? Well, it's as predictable as a bad sitcom rerun. When in doubt, Moscow clings to 3 old tricks: backing domestic opponents, cranking up the propaganda machine, and dramatically declaring that without its benevolent hand, its neighbors will crumble into dystopian ruin. Unfortunately for the Kremlin, Armenia's Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan isn't just standing his ground, he's landscaping it with Western seeds. Yerevan's resilience is showcased by its handling of protests and rejecting Russian propaganda. The ruling government has not only managed to quell the unrest, but also articulated a clear vision of Armenia's future, one that's securely fenced with international recognition and not a Russian checkpoint in sight. And let's not overlook the cultural shifts here. With the Russian Orthodox Church's influence on a downslide, Moscow's soft power seems to be melting faster than ice cream in the summer sun. Reports are buzzing with how Armenia's defiance might just set a trend for other nations such as Tajikistan. And imagine that, a chorus of nations redefining their Russian relationships, not out of coercion, but out of choice. So while Moscow is busy guarding its fortress of solitude, its neighbors are busy building bridges. And in today's interconnected world, who do you think is on the right side of history? As these nations draft their future chapters, one thing is clear: they might just be writing Moscow out of their narratives. And now, here to shed more light on the issue at hand is our guest, Bruce Pannier, correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So the CSTO, there are quite a few myths surrounding this organization. Some people think it's something akin to NATO's evil twin. But is it even that, especially in its current shape and form?
No, I don't think you could call it some kind of analog of NATO in any way. The CSTO countries, for one thing, it's not so voluntary. NATO is, if you want to join, then you go through a process of accession, and you in, or maybe it takes a while. But anyway, it's the individual country has to want to be a member of NATO. Now, I mean, in theory, that's true of the CSTO, but in fact, Moscow puts a lot of pressure on certain countries to become NATO members of the CSTO, and they really don't have much choice. And of course, for some of them, there is literally no other choice. If they want any kind of extra security guarantees for themselves, they almost have to join the CSTO because there's nobody else around that's going to bring them on board.
Which makes Armenia's case all the more interesting. But before we actually move on to the present day, a bit of history, perhaps. The membership of the CSCO, now this is not something quite as illustrious as in the case of NATO. It's not such a long history, right? Nevertheless, there were some changes. So you said it's difficult to leave, but were there any countries that left the CSCO or left what used to be kind of like, the predecessor to the current structure of the CSTO? Are there any cases which may actually serve as a sort of inspiration for countries today which are hesitant about whether to stay within the ranks of this organization?
Oh, definitely. This organization's been around for more than 30 years. And when it first started, the declaration was signed in Tashkent. I believe the membership was up to 9 or 10 countries at least, back in the 90s. But countries have peeled off since then. The best example is Uzbekistan, which is one of the countries in Central Asia. Of course, Uzbekistan was a member of the CSTO, or what was called it was a different name, but it became the CSTO. And in the late 1990s, when the Taliban showed up at the borders of Central Asia, Uzbekistan was talking about, that we want some guarantees that if this spills over the border, that the CSTO is going to come and help us out. And it was the Belarus president, who still, of course, at that time was Alexander Lukashenko. He said he wouldn't send any troops at all to defend Central Asia. And because of that, Uzbekistan withdrew from the organization. It joined again later. About 7 years later, it joined for a while, but then it withdrew again after 6 years and hasn't come back since. It's really down. Like I said, it was 10, I can't remember exactly, 10 or 11 countries of the CIS, I think, for a while that were in it at the very, very start. And now it's down to 6 and maybe 5, with Armenia.
Exactly. So the membership is not set in stone, but if a country is still hesitant, are there any compelling reasons to stay? In other words, what does the CSTO actually do? Because in theory, we can say, many things about any sort of project, organization, or initiative. But unless it's actually implemented in practice, theory isn't really something that's worth actually spending your money on an ongoing basis.
This is obviously a question. Now, on paper, the CSTO is supposed to come to the defense of an individual member country if they face an external threat. So this is reassuring. I mentioned the case of Afghanistan in the late 1990s. That's what makes it so attractive to some of the countries in Central Asia. In fact, as we've seen in the Armenian case with Azerbaijan, when Armenia invoked that and said we want the members to come to our defense because we're being attacked by a non-CSTO country. And we need some help. And of course, that's when they started to go deep into the wording of the charter for the CSTO and decided that this wasn't something that they were going to get involved in. They said, it's over an enclave that was disputed. So there was no reason, there was no obligation to come to Armenia's help. Now, what it actually
it's
has
no Article 5, in other words, right?
Pardon me?
It's no Article 5, in other words, which is kind of ironic because Russia keeps disputing whether Article 5 is actually going to work, and they keep spreading those fears, especially in the Baltic states. Meanwhile, at their very own so-called equivalent to NATO, their own Article 5 equivalent literally didn't ignite. It just was, it was left on paper. Nothing actually came out of it, right? Which caused quite a lot of concern among members, but also fury among the Armenians, right?
Yeah, well, and understandably, Armenia has been doing their share as part of the organization, participating in the exercises. We'll get to the one deployment the CSTO ever did, I'm sure, pretty soon, but Armenia participated in that in 2022. So, I mean, they've done everything according to the book, so to speak, and they've I understand why they felt they should have been entitled to have some help when they called for it, but it didn't show up.
So now they're saying they're not going to pay anymore, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it, and one can understand that. When they've been paying, there was a Russian base in Armenia, still is. So they had every reason to believe that if they finally needed help, that they would receive it, and of course they didn't. And the CSTO has been like that. There was ethnic violence in Kyrgyzstan in 2010, in June. And the Kyrgyz authorities were also looking to see if the CSTO could step in and help them restore order. But once again, the CSTO ruled that this was an internal problem, so it wasn't an external threat, and opted to not send anybody at all and said, it's a domestic dispute, and you're going to have to figure it out yourself. I mentioned in early 2022, strangely, when Kazakhstan was having unrest in January 2022, it did request CSTO help to guard key facilities in the area. But it was based on the Kazakh government at the time saying that they were facing threats from foreign terrorists. So that was the only time that the CSTO actually sent troops to a conflict zone, I suppose you could call it. And again, they didn't participate in any combat activities. They guarded key facilities in several cities of Kazakhstan, but didn't actually go out and try to do anything to restore order.
So it certainly helped that Russia considered its own interests as having been threatened. So they thought, okay, why not send in the CSTO to stabilize the situation, hoping perhaps that Kazakhstan would drift even closer into its orbit, which didn't happen. So, so much for investment in this regard. Now, isn't this all related to the issue, basically, that unlike NATO, which does actually have real threats around it, one of them being Russia, naturally, the CSCO doesn't really have any sort of potential aggressor, any sort of external threat which could materialize, could literally attack a member state, send armies across the border and trigger whatever the equivalent of Article 5 actually is? Or is it all just about, justifying Russia's position there, being able to maintain these military bases too, which is a big problem, right? But no real external threat, which makes it necessary to justify the existence of the CSTO every now and then, even if it's a bit artificial.
No, I agree with that. At the moment, one can't foresee an external threat. I mean, there was talk early on in when Russia launched its full-scale war on Ukraine that somehow or another Russia would finesse the language of the CSTO charter and see if it couldn't drag some of these other countries in. It didn't work. It still hasn't. There's no basis for calling in help. But that's about as close as it really got. One can't foresee, the Taliban crossing the border into Central Asia or China launching an attack or anything. So, it really is kind of toothless. What it's become, and what the Kazakh example showed, I think, is that the CSTO, depending on how relations are with the Kremlin, the CSTO can come in and prop up a friendly government in one of the member states and make sure that it doesn't fall. But as far as defending them against an external threat, there's really no precedent, no basis to believe that would happen.
So, to paraphrase a quote from President Emmanuel Macron, which, by the way, didn't age very well because he changed his mind too, and NATO has changed, but the quote itself, paraphrased, would be that the CSTO is a bit brain dead at the moment. But even if it is so, is it possible to actually get rid of it nowadays, to simply say, look, we've had enough, we're leaving? Because Russia might say, oh, no, you don't. There is a military base on your territory, so you're not going to get away so easily. I mean, this is Armenia's case right now, isn't it?
Yeah, Armenia, but I would also mention that Russia has military bases in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan too. It's really, I think the organization is only surviving because of Vladimir Putin. It was a moribund organization. Even at the start of this century for several years. I'd mentioned that Uzbekistan had withdrawn in the late 1990s. And the CSTO existed on paper, but it really didn't do very much. It was more Putin that kind of pushed it forward and gave it a sort of new life, and especially in response to the fact that there was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which also has a mutual military defense component in its charter too. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was running military or exercises 15, 16 years ago. And that kind of worried people in the Kremlin because China is a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so is Russia. But Russia started to worry that China was gaining too much influence in the security sphere in Central Asia. So that's when Vladimir Putin and the Russian government really pushed the CSTO and started holding regular exercises in every one of the countries as often as possible. And we see that although the Shanghai Cooperation Organization still does conduct military exercises, not anywhere on the level that they were in 2006, 2007, 2008. The CSTO has taken over that responsibility, and it's understood in China that, and probably welcomed in China, that the CSTO is responsible for security, certainly in Central Asia and in Belarus, for example, and in theory in Armenia, although that hasn't really worked out.
One very quick question. These military bases, they have a lease up to the 2040s generally, with a difference of 2 years in between, I think, Tajikistan and Armenia. Do you think there is any possibility of these bases being vacated earlier than that? Has it ever happened with a Russian military facility on foreign soil that it was voluntarily abandoned?
Well, again, I think that this organization exists because Vladimir Putin wants it to exist. Now, when he dies, it'll be interesting to see how long the CSTO, or it probably might exist on paper, but whether it really is an effective organization remains to be seen. We'll have to wait and see. But it's in certainly Tajikistan's interest to have the Russian military base there. I don't think they really want the Russian. They're very close to China, and who knows? Relations are good now. Who knows what it's going to be like in 10 years? Same thing with Kyrgyzstan. It provides, again, the CSTO has become an organization that can prop up a government that's failing or possibly facing being ousted by popular revolt in the country. That's what the CSTO seems to have developed into, at least in Central Asia, is it can prop up these governments. So I don't think they want them to leave. But after Putin dies, these bases might still exist, but they might lose some of their teeth, so to speak.
So in other words, from the contemplated NATO's evil twin to glorified riot police. That is a bit of a downfall there. Bruce Pannier was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you for the invitation.
And now it's time for Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The EU Council has approved a major package of non-military assistance to Ukraine. However, the 54 billion euros in aid is tied to the implementation of reforms.
The bloc's Ukraine plan, passed during an EU Council meeting on Tuesday, lays out aid payments throughout the next 4 years. About 2 billion euros will be distributed immediately, with the rest being transferred incrementally as the previously agreed upon reforms will be implemented. The first 2 installments will be handed out as loans, with the rest being direct subsidies. The aid is meant to help Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction, and modernization, with military aid being transferred separately.
The Georgian parliament passed the so-called Foreign Agents Bill in its final reading. A scuffle between MPs erupted in the parliamentary chamber as the vote was taking place.
The incident began as MPs of the ruling Georgian Dream Party got into a heated argument with those from the United National Movement, the largest opposition party. The argument escalated into a minor scuffle, although no blows were exchanged. The situation outside the parliament was also tense as protesters clashed with police. The controversial law would require NGOs to disclose any foreign sources of funding. Organizations receiving significant support from abroad would have to register as foreign agents. Protests against the law have been ongoing for weeks, and the bill has been also criticized by EU and US officials.
Turkey signed an agreement with Azerbaijan, which aims to expand several natural gas pipelines. This will increase Europe's access to non-Russian fossil fuels as a result.
Turkish Energy Minister Alparslan Bayraktar and Azerbaijani Economy Minister Mikhail Kabarov signed the agreement in Istanbul on Tuesday. The deal envisions the expansion of 2 pipelines connecting both countries through Georgia, as well as the construction of a new one. In addition to transporting Azerbaijani gas to Turkey, they can also be used to transport gas from Turkmenistan across the Caspian Sea. After being exported to Turkey, the natural gas can be further exported to the European Union. The bloc expressed an increased interest in Azerbaijani and Central Asian gas following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions on Russian fossil fuels. The demand for natural gas is growing as it is seen as a cleaner energy source than other fossil fuels.
An advisor to the Estonian president on security matters stated that Estonia is considering sending troops to Ukraine. In an interview for the outlet Breaking Defense, Madis Roll clarified that these forces would not be engaged in combat.
The proposal would see Estonian troops take over some of the rear echelon roles, freeing more Ukrainian troops for active combat roles. This would still be unlikely to fully avoid casualties, as Russian long-range missiles frequently strike targets all over Ukraine. Roll stated that Estonia would prefer a broader NATO mission with multiple states sending their troops as well, although sending forces as part of a small coalition is being considered as well. The official's comments come after a similar, narrower Lithuanian proposal. Last week, Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė offered to send a training mission to Ukraine.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.